Hello my friends. Women have been tortured throughout the ages, often by men who were trying to control them, and these methods were so horrific that they would send shivers down your spine just thinking about them. Women were tortured to suppress their sexual desires, to silence them from speaking and expressing their opinions, and to force them to conform to the prevailing standards of beauty. Most of the time, they were tortured simply to break their spirits and keep them submissive to the desire and power of men who feared what a liberated woman might mean. In this episode, my friends, we have collected 15 brutal methods of torturing women that were used in the past, and some of which are still used today. Stay tuned. 1. Spanish donkey. This device was also known as the wooden horse, and it was a torture device that caused a woman's body to be cut into two halves very slowly, starting from her genitals. This method was used during the Middle Ages and during the era of the Spanish Inquisition, and a similar device was used on American Civil War prisoners from the Confederate camp. This brutal torture instrument consisted of a pyramid-shaped stake with a sharp end that stood on 2 or sometimes 4 legs. The woman was forced to ride on its sharp end, which was sometimes made serrated until it slowly penetrated the crotch area of the victim's legs. Sometimes, weights were tied to a woman's legs in order to enable the sharp end of the stake to sink deeper into her body, eventually cutting it in half. Although this method of torture was disgusting and terrible, some people considered it sexually provocative, as some BDSM lovers adopted its model in their sexual practices. The woman would lie on the model on her stomach, hanging her legs and arms downward, exposing her buttocks and vagina. 2. Foot dressing in China. Foot bandaging was a common practice in China from 1,000 years ago until late in the 20th century, and was a process aimed at forcing women from a young age to conform to the very strange standards of beauty prevailing in China, causing them permanent disability for life. In ancient China, the first standard of beauty for women was small feet, so families bandaged the feet of their young daughters in order to prevent them from growing after being disfigured, with the aim of attracting husbands from noble and wealthy families. The prevailing ideal foot length at that time was 9 centimeters, and it was known as the golden lotus, followed by the silver lotus, which was a foot whose length did not exceed 12 centimeters. Any length less than this was known as the iron lotus, and it was not a socially acceptable foot length. The process of bandaging the feet to reach gold and silver lotus standards was done by crushing the toes of young girls and then bandaging them twisted inward with silk fabrics. The girls were then forced to walk on their broken feet in order to cause a metatarsal fracture as well, and these bandages were tightened tightly. More and more with time until the desired goal and the desired foot length are reached. 3. Chastity belts. Although chastity belts were not designed to be a torture device in the full sense, they caused everyone who was forced to wear them extreme discomfort and constant discomfort. Just imagine, dear reader, wearing one of them forever. The victims of this tool were mostly the daughters or wives of obsessive and domineering men. It is believed that the history of the use of these belts goes back to the period of the Crusades when they were used as a means to prevent rape. The first recorded and known use of them dates back to the year 1405 in the Italian city of Florence, and then their many forms appeared. The modern ones continued to be used until 1930. The sole purpose of chastity belts was not to prevent a woman from having sex. Rather, it went beyond that to prevent her from even masturbating and fondling herself. It was tied around her waist and there was no other way to remove it other than using its original key, which was found by the girl's father or husband. Sometimes the openings on the device that corresponded to the vaginal opening, so that a woman could urinate and expel menstrual blood, sometimes had sharp teeth pointing inward, and these teeth would tear off the penis of any unlucky person who dared to have sex with a girl wearing it. 4. Breast sickles, to torture single mothers. The breast scythe was a terrifying tool that caused terrible pain to its female victims. It consisted of 2 large, pointed, symmetrical forks. It was used to tear a woman's breasts, sometimes completely amputating them from her body. It was sometimes heated over a fire before using it. The aim of its use was to mutilate the body of a woman who became pregnant outside of wedlock, or every woman who was accused of having sex outside of wedlock, or who was accused of marital infidelity. The use of this brutal tool stopped during the Middle Ages, but the terrorist organization ISIS has recently been using it as punishment for Syrian women who were breastfeeding their children in public places. 5. The bridle of a bastard. For every man in the Middle Ages, the easiest way to make his wife finally shut up was by forcing her to wear a woman's bridle, which was invented in the first place to restrain the tongue of a gossiping and backbiting woman, or every woman who complained a lot, given that backbiting in those times was. It is considered an act of Satan. The first use of this device in history was recorded during the 16th century. It was an iron mask surrounding the head of the victim woman, and sharp protrusions were sometimes added to it that were inserted into the victim's mouth and positioned above the tongue, making uttering the simplest letters very painful. However, the main torture intended behind this mask is psychological torture, because after being placed inside it, the victim woman was led through the city streets and public squares to defame her, while passers-by and onlookers spat on her and described her with the ugliest qualities. 6. Cutting a woman in half with a chainsaw. The woman had virtually no escape from this horrific treatment, and there was no way out of this nightmare for her. This method of torture was used during the Middle Ages as an economic method aimed at inflicting the greatest amount of torture with the least amount of effort. It only required a saw operated by two people, a lack of moral composure, and great endurance. Women who were accused of sorcery, heresy, or adultery were hung upside down with their legs spread, and the purpose of hanging them in this way was to keep the blood flowing to their brains so that they would remain conscious while the saw penetrated them. This process sometimes lasted for many hours before the executioners were finally able to cut the body in half, while others preferred to stop in the abdominal area to make the poor victim's torment last longer. 7. Pairs of torment to torture every woman accused of having an abortion. The name of this torture device suggests its nature and form, as it was called so because of its great resemblance to the pear fruit, but it is not as delicious as it. It was used during the Middle Ages until the 17th century. This iron tool is divided into 4 sections that mimic the petals in plants that open little by turning a screw key at the other end of the tool. It was used specifically on its victims, women who were accused of abortion or practicing sorcery. The pear of torment was inserted into the victim's vagina, then its petals opened little by little until it caused her genitals to rupture. The device was also used on anyone suspected of engaging in homosexual sex, and some modifications were added to it later to insert it into the mouths of people accused of heresy, and its petals opened so wide that they shattered their jaw bones. 8. Burning witches. Death by burning was the ultimate punishment for women accused of witchcraft, sorcery, treason, or heresy. Men accused of heresy were executed by hanging or drowning, and burning women was common in England from the 15th century until the 18th century. Victims of execution by burning often fainted as a result of inhaling the smoke emanating from the burning wood beneath them before being consumed by the flames. As for those who were not lucky enough to remain awake, they suffered a truly gruesome death. The first stage of their torment was the tearing of the dermis layer in their skin, and then the fire then consumed the layer of fat, and the only relief you could feel was when the fire finally damaged the nerves in your skin to the point where you couldn't feel anything until you eventually died. 9. Female circumcision. There is no doubt that many around the world now consider the practice of female circumcision a barbaric practice of torture, but many also still practice it extensively, as the World Health Organization estimated that more than 200 million girls today have undergone this mutilation procedure, which has no expected health benefits. Its sole goal is to discourage the girl's sexual desire. Most of the time, these operations were carried out using traditional tools that were unsanitary and inconsistent with the minimum standards of hygiene. The young girl, no more than 15 years old, was pinned to the ground by members of her family, while an elderly woman from the village removed her clitoris and sometimes even the labia minora in her vagina using a sharpened traditional tool. In many cases, this causes complications and infections in the victim that ultimately lead to death. 10. Stoning to death, which continues to this day in some areas. The punishment of stoning to death is considered one of the oldest and most primitive punishments in human history. After all, it is nothing more than the process of continuously throwing stones at someone's head until they die. Ezoic. Although the punishment of stoning to death also applies to men, women constitute the overwhelming majority of victims of this brutal and public method of execution in today's world. The punishment of stoning to death reappeared after a relative disappearance for several centuries in Iran during the Islamic Revolution in 1980. The category of women accused of having sex outside of marriage was the category most exposed to this punishment, and the victims of this category were often subjected to stoning by members of their families themselves. What is known as honor killings. In preparation for the punishment of stoning to death, a deep, narrow hole is dug to place the victim, who is tied tightly upright and only her head remains out of the dirt. Then a group of male executors throw stones and rocks at her head until she dies. As these lines are being written, about 15 countries around the world still apply this brutal death penalty, including Nigeria, Sudan, Iran, and Pakistan. In 2016, an incident was recorded in which 2 girls in Syria were stoned to death after 2 men were found in their homes, while the 2 men were flogged 50 lashes. 11. Sexual torture and rape. Rape has been a common method of torture against women throughout the ages. An example of this is the massacre in the Chinese city of Nanking, which was committed by Japanese occupation soldiers, where they raped and then killed thousands of Chinese women. Rape was also used as a means of extracting information and confessions from detainees and prisoners, as Amnesty International discovered that rape was routinely used on women as a means of getting them to confess to their crimes in Mexican prisons. Many Iranian prisons were also accused of beating and raping female prisoners, while rape was also widely used by ISIS as a means of torturing them. Rape is perhaps the oldest and most persistent method of torturing women in history. 12. Republican marriage. The mere thought of being naked in front of a man was torture for the devout Christian nuns, let alone being stripped of her clothes, tied tightly to the body of another man who was also naked, and then thrown into the river. This was the concept of republican marriage, and this punishment was particularly imposed on monks and nuns during the Rule of Terror, during the French Revolutionary War. This punishment was particularly common in the city of Nantes, France, between the years 1793 and 1794. Jean-Baptiste Carré is the one who orders its implementation. Sometimes, instead of drowning the victims in the river, a group of people would circle around them and inflict continuous sword blows on them until they died. 13. The iron chair. This iron chair may be the most uncomfortable piece of furniture anyone could own. The victim, who was forced to sit on this chair, which was covered with hundreds of very sharp jagged nails, was tied up and forced to sit on it for long hours during which she would bleed to death. This torture device was used for the first time during the Middle Ages and was used on both sexes. However, women were subjected to another, more brutal use of this device, as after being tied to it, a fire would be lit under it, thus causing the victim to be burned and bleed to death, and thus her torment would be doubled. 14. Wheel, Catherine. The Catherine wheel is considered one of the most brutal methods of execution that emerged during the Middle Ages. It was a large cartwheel that was sometimes covered with pointed nails. The victims were tied from their backs to this spiked wheel that was lying on the ground, and then their bones were smashed. By beating them continuously with a harsh club, and after breaking all the bones in the victim's body, they were left there to die slowly, and the death of most victims of this horrific method took many days. This method was called Catherine's wheel, because it is said that Saint Catherine of Alexandria was executed by it at the hands of the Roman Emperor Maxentius. It is also known as the crushing wheel. 15. The waist corset that distorted women in ancient times. The appearance of these women's waist corsets dates back 500 years in the past, and many modern-day feminists point out that women at that time were forced to wear them to conform to the whims of men, and to conform to aesthetic standards that were incompatible with health. That is, it was just like bandaging feet in China. The first concrete evidence of the use of corsets dates back to 1530, but they became popular during the 18th century and were soon used as women's underwear. Women's waist trainers cause many harmful health problems, as they limit the breathing process, and wearing them continuously ultimately leads to distortion of the waist, and may cause distortion and change the position of the internal organs, while causing atrophy of the back muscles as well. We have reached the end of the video. Tell us what torture instrument affected you. Don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to receive the new video. See you soon.